everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker and I got a haircut. Now it's time for a review of this new Daniel Rossen album, You Belong There. Former member of Grizzly Bear, multi-instrumentalist, indie folk artist Daniel Rossen coming back into the musical landscape after a fairly lengthy time away. Of course, with Grizzly Bear now having gone separate ways, it's been about 5 years since Daniel has put out any new music. With the exception of a single in I think 2018 for Record Store Day. Anyway, this long-awaited solo album has come along and we've got a healthy 10 songs spanning about 45 minutes, a very solid offering of tracks that is really emotionally in touch with itself. These passages are at times exceptionally joyful, but most of the time they're very melancholy in a tone that even during the lighter tracks, there's this shroud of moody writing that really looms over you. This whole album has a really transient feel to it. There's a journey that Daniel is going on here that he's bringing you along with. It's particularly thoughtful, meticulously designed, and at its weakest points really only feels like a couple of tracks maybe go on a little bit too long at certain points, but it's so generally keenly focused that it hardly matters. And the lyrics on this album are really nice deep cuts of thoughtful, insightful poetry. It's all very genuine and cut from this cloth of telling a story with minute vagueness, not really giving everything away, but still giving you enough contextually to really excellently tell these stories. It's a passage. The first track feels like a song about being lost on your path and holding on to love as a way of keeping hope. It's entirely touching and deeply moving. Daniel talks about searching for a clearing as if to rest on this long journey towards an unclear future. Even these moments of respite are passages to the next thing. Shadow in the Frame focuses in on Daniel's new daughter and the impartiality of life, death, and the grander movement of time as a whole. There's a deep struggle with the anxiety of loving and caring for a flashing shadow in the frame of being, going from one point to the next, introducing someone into the world to be powerless in the face of the massive changes happening in the everyday world. Daniel talks about how we're sightless creatures who all find our way in a very apt description of the human experience overall, all while cliffs and hills will wash away and continents will sink. It's emotionally very raw and brilliant. The title track, You Belong There, is a very short track with a short poem for the lyrics, which is probably one of the more vague moments on the album, talking about a quiet place of masses moving back and forth. I do kind of see this as another poem, maybe about his daughter in the womb, but I think it could have several interpretations, but they're all they all live in such vagueness that it's kind of hard to say anything for certain for this one, but I do like the fact that the poetry is short and sweet. With this being one of the shorter songs, it also doesn't really have a ton of time to develop musically, but I could also see it functioning as an interlude track with the way the instrumentals tend to shift and chaotically sway in this very anxious build that almost feels free from tempo. Each instrument is in touch with the other, but they're all very much running their own course. It's a really interesting track to listen to the dichotomy of the instruments to. Unpeopled Space is a bit of a meditation on clearing way for life and the metaphorical pushing of the boulder up the hill that is making space to exist and only for it to be reclaimed by nature. And this is one of the lengthier songs on the album. Like I said earlier, one of the few points on the album where things do tend to go on a little bit too long. This whole thing does get a little bit long-winded. However, this song has an excellent, tight instrumental, and not to mention more top-notch lyricism. Daniel talks a bit about the futility of working for work's sake, kind of kicking around the artistic stone for a little bit too long, until you're totally lost in the activity and no longer actually focused on the end goal. It's another very transient feeling song, and in the end, the length of the track ends up really emphasizing the meaning in the lyrics. Celia is another short track that feels like an homage to simpler, albeit more rustic living. There's a desire for simplicity that is in this song that almost feels a little bit quaint, but still drives home this fairly emotional track. Tangle is one of the more dramatic tracks on the album with a really great piano backing track that flows along in a hypnotic rising and falling style with mixing notes of what sounds like a very subtle synthesizer. Lyrically, this track kind of sounds like it's talking about either a car crash or maybe even like a really physical fight. I think the title Tangle, it could kind of go either way. I'll Wait for Your Visit ends up being the longest track on the album, just shy of 7 minutes. This song ends up being one of the most heavy tracks, talking about a building split between a couple who drift apart after routine fights and debates that ultimately seem to be over nothing and never ending. Negotiating over the contents of the dustbin, which is empty anyway. The song ends with some thoughts on maybe reaching out to this other person, which results in just waiting instead, because if they wanted to be involved in this, they would come and visit, maybe hash things out. Instrumentally, the song has a really complicated trade between these complicated sporadic guitar parts and slow piano passages. It's a really great piece and one of the highlights of the album for me. Keeper and Kin to me ends up being one of the only songs that really starts to drag a bit. This song ends up being one of the more slow developing tracks that has a full, beautiful performance, but doesn't really end up developing too much as to keep things moving along at a reasonable pace. The lyrics I'm also a bit lukewarm on. There's nothing really inherently bad about them, but there's really not too much to them, so it feels like a song that trudges along a bit and doesn't really have nearly as much to say as some of the other cuts here. The last one gets a little bit more jaunty with its guitar parts for a track that feels really nostalgic for this future of a last day where Daniel is sharing his love with someone. Letting down the shields of his youth, these emotional walls begin to slowly drop for this person who in the end he absolutely feels he needs. It's kind of an interesting take on this and really an open look at some of these self-defense mechanisms and how resisting desire ends up being the exact wrong thing to do in the end. Repeat the Pattern kind of loops back into the initial ideas the album leads with on its passage, slowly touching on this album's overarching themes of temporary loss and joy. It's a great track to top the album off with in a really light, folky sound that kind of makes me think of some of the lighter Pink Floyd tracks with a bit of a hint of like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Yeah man, this album has a really lovely sound to it. I don't know if every song is truly great, but they are all very well composed, and I think that this is generally a very good listen and has some really broad appeal. It may not be everyone's thing, but it's far more accessible than most of the albums that are generally this downright depressing. Though I'm not even sure depressing is the right word. I think there's like a heavy conflict in this album's various themes that all kind of embody the human experience. I think a more correct word would have been cathartic. I'm feeling a pretty solid 7 on this album. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of the album in the comments below, and if you liked this video, drop a like and remember to subscribe, and if you want to help out the channel further, check out my Instagram and my Reverb store. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.